The importance of smaller portions of Polynesia cannot be emphasized enough when it comes to the work of and history of cultural anthropologists and their discipline. What is referred to as Micro-Polynesia, or the Polynesian Core Cultural Area, has been traditionally assigned or associated with the work of Bronislaw Malinowski and Margaret Mead. When anthropologists take a closer look at Polynesia, along with other regions such as Micronesia and Melanesia, it really provides them with important social structures in the study of global human social behavior. So many of the structures that are recognized in Polynesia and some of the associated island nations that surround it and the language communities that inhabit those nations really become foundational to what it means to be human. In what is referred to as a series of islands known as New Ireland, we find the Tanga. And the Tanga are very unique people. They live in a clan society, and they have very unique forms of body art, or what is traditionally referred to as tattooing. There are many rules which govern who may tattoo who and what kinds of designs will be produced on the skin of the face, the skin of the upper arms, the skin of the upper torso. And we find this throughout Polynesia. The Tanganese people follow a traditional descent system which is referred to as Hawaiian. So too, many Americans living in the continental United States follow a similar pattern or system of descent. This system of descent is one in which kinship relationships, or relationships that are defined by blood and obligation, are recognized bilaterally. And what I mean by this is these social relationships are recognized both in one's mother's side and one's father's side. So as you calculate your family or your system of kinship, very often you will follow a descent system which has you recognize responsibilities to relatives on your mother's side and on your father's side. Though you may value these relationships a bit differently, you still recognize family as being bilateral, or a product of both your mother's blood and your father's blood. Well, the Tanganese people have a similar kin reckoning system. However, as they begin to value relatives in relation to tattooing and then also scarification as it relates to male, where you have these repeated cuts in the skin and the development of patterns that are scarified, they recognize the father's side of this bilateral descent system to have specific roles, or to be of an importance to this ritual, to this ceremony. When we start to look deeply into the rules and patterns of behavior which govern a ceremony, and we find in this case one section of one's kinship to be emphasized more than the other, we attach some additional terminology to it in order to better understand it and to share it with the public. In this case, we would, in a sense, attach this notion of a patrilineal system of social organization within that larger Hawaiian descent system. The patriline, the patrilineage, those individuals, those relatives who are bound together through the blood of men on one's father's side, in a sense, are involved in both tattooing and scarification among the Tanganese. We see this same kind of responsibility, and again, a responsibility that follows the blood of men over successive generations and the relatives who are bound together by marriage and by blood to those men throughout Polynesia and throughout the many larger clan systems which are, or find home in a sense, in the Polynesian region. Now take a moment to write down the definitions for these three qualities of kinship as it's understood by, in this case, anthropologists. So be able to understand, in this case, what a patrilineage is, what makes it different from something like a matrilineage, what kinship is, and then what these larger systems of descent are, and how we define each. We should never speak of Polynesian clans without referencing the work of a sociologist and historian, in this case, Max Weber. Weber was a contemporary of Durkheim. However, he was really developing out of a German sociological school of thought. Like Durkheim, Max Weber studied the role of religion and politics in issues of social consensus and ultimately social control. Let's take a closer look at Weber's own words. He writes, "Corporate domination is political. Its existence and the validity of its laws within a defined territorial area are guaranteed by an administration through the continuous application and threat of force." In a sense, he's describing a state. It's a compulsory political association with a continuous organization. He continues, social behavior, especially of a corporate group, now this would be the clan or any sort of large regional system of descent which organizes people into large communities and then sub-communities. Social behavior, again, especially of a corporate group, will be politically oriented if its purpose is to influence the leadership of the corporate political group, either towards the appropriation, allocation, or reallocation of governing powers. So again, it's similar to a snake eating its tail when Weber looks at power structures within these corporate communities and the rituals embedded within those communities that seem to glue them together. That the control, in a sense, is supported by the community. It's supported by their traditions, by their cultural history, and in a sense, it then, through a process of continuing historical change, reallocates that control. This is a very complex concept, but it is integral to how we understand the functionality of not only kinship and kinship patterns, but these larger regional systems of descent that are rooted in those kinship rules and behaviors. Let's use an ethnographic example to bring together all of these ideas. We'll take a look at a language community, the Tiwi, associated with two historic islands off of Australia's northwestern coast, Bathurst Island and Melville Island. The Tiwi are unique because of their contrastive nature. They have historically been understood to be foragers, or hunters and gatherers. However, their system of human social organization and the languages associated and the terminology associated with that system really relate to a much larger corporate group, in this case a kind of clan culture. The Tiwi people are also very unique because for a good part of their history they remained isolated, not only from the cultures of mainland Australia, but also the explorers associated with European expansion and colonialism in this region of the Pacific. This means that when many Aboriginal populations associated with places like Australia were experiencing a great deal of acculturation, the people of Melville and Bathurst Islands remained isolated. Many anthropologists looking at this historical circumstance have asked, in a sense, why? What aspects of Tiwi language and life helped them or allowed them to be more isolated than other communities living in close proximity to these island groups? Well, Durkheim, as you know, studied many historical cultures in this region, especially areas within the coastal geography of what is today Australia. And his perspective on religion really becomes an important concept as anthropologists begin to better understand how isolationism occurred within Tiwi life. Here's a definition of religion according to Durkheim. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community all those who adhere to them. The question that we have to ask ourselves as students of culture relates to this relationship between religion and the idea of setting things apart and making them forbidden and governing that forbidden quality of those objects, of those materials with cultural laws, and the role that that perspective may have played in kinship. So something as simple as marriage and its relationship to religious thought. This is where many anthropologists recognize there to be a bridge or a clue for better understanding how this whole process of isolation, while still in close geographic proximity, can occur. Timbembinumi, or an expression that is associated with Tiwian life and their cosmology, provides us with that bridge. The bridge, in this case, between a religious institutional perspective or a social institution like religion and kinship calculation and practices of betrothal and marriage, and how all of this, when taken together, provides the Tiwi people with the ability to remain in contact yet separate or isolated from practices in the outside world that they recognize to be damaging or threatening. This perspective, this expression, Timbanbinumi, translates roughly in the Tiwian language to home of the dead. This is where dead souls travel and from which outsiders or melees come. For the Tiwi people, and again, the word Tiwi actually means we, so that gives you a sense of how strong their community is. Timbanbinumi is a place within their cosmology that is outside of their island nation. It is everywhere where Tiwi are not. This means that anyone coming from the outside world is recognized as a potential threat. And there are a variety of taboos which disallow Tiwi people from making close, intimate contact with people from the outside world or the world of the dead. As I said before, the Tiwi people are foragers. Their subsistence strategy is one of hunting and gathering. This means that they live in small, tightly knit communities, often comprised of one or a handful of extended families. They organize themselves around a territory and around seasonal components within that territory. Tiwi households are polygamous, meaning that they have marriage practices where one individual is married to multiple individuals of the opposite sex. The kind of polygamy that is practiced by Tiwi populations, at least historically, is where you have a male marrying multiple females. Women, upon reaching sexual maturity in traditional or historic Tiwi life, are required to be married. Now, there is a danger if they are not. According to historical Tiwi practices, spirits have the ability to impregnate unmarried women. In fact, spirits are responsible for all pregnancies, according to this tradition, but no children must be fatherless. That is why a husband must always be present to take responsibility. This concept of danger coming from outside of the Tiwi world led to some very unique historical practices having to do with marriage rights. I have two unique examples for you. Anthropologists working in this region in the late 1950s and early 1960s witnessed the betrothal of children, in this case to older men. Now, this was not a traditional betrothal or eventually marriage in the sense that there was a cohabitation. What this was a ceremony that bound the female child to a man in this case, or a sexually mature man, and provided the child with protection from the outside world. In the same way, widows, female widows, would immediately marry at the graveside of their late husbands, again, to protect the woman in this case from the spirits outside of the Tiwi landscape. As you can imagine, and again, this is just one ceremony within a really vast culture and a very historical culture. As you can imagine, this created a significant amount of isolation between people who were part of this language community, the other indigenous language communities around them, and those language communities and cultures that were coming from Central Europe. This, many anthropologists believe, preserved Tiwi life. So it was a combination of factors that really explained the very late acculturation that occurred for the people who lived in these two island groups. When we step back and look at this as students of cultural anthropology, we realize that there are many different institutions and many different traditions that are involved in the process. So as students of anthropology, we recognize a wide variety of cultural institutions or social institutions and practices at work in explaining this unique history. We have kinship, we have systems of descent, and we have geographical or territorial units of how people are organized. Take a moment to jot down these three final definitions in your lecture notes. You will note that they really bring together many of the ideas that we've been discussing up to this point. We have the territorial or physical unit of the band. We have the very complex system of descent in the clan, and we have the more theoretical concept of control or social control in the corporate community.